For most of the last century, the story of human origins has felt reassuringly clear. Our species, Homo sapiens, emerged somewhere in Africa, developed modern traits, and then spread outward in a series of migrations that eventually populated the entire planet. Along the way, we encountered other human groups, replaced some, mixed with a few, and carried our lineage forward into the present. It was a story built from fossils, stone tools, and scattered archaeological sites, arranged into a timeline that appeared logical. Africa was described as the cradle of humanity. Yet within that cradle, the picture was often simplified. A single origin point, a relatively narrow ancestral population, a clean departure from the continent, followed by expansion and adaptations were explained as recent and superficial, shaped mostly by climate and geography after humans left Africa. For a long time, there was little reason to seriously challenge this framework. Bones can only tell part of the story. Tools and artifacts reveal behavior, not ancestry, and Africa's tropical environments, harsh on ancient remains, left large gaps in the physical record. The deeper past of our species remained difficult to access, and so the broad outlines of the narrative went largely unquestioned. But over the last 2 decades, something fundamental has changed. A new kind of evidence has begun to speak, quietly at first, then with increasing clarity. Ancient DNA, recovered from human remains, tens of thousands of years old, has started to fill in the spaces that fossils could not. It has exposed relationships that were invisible before, and histories that left no clear trace in stone or bone. What this genetic evidence has revealed is not a simple confirmation of what we thought we knew. Instead, it suggests that Africa itself held a far deeper, more complex human story than previously imagined. A story of multiple ancient populations, long separations, unexpected reunions, and forgotten lineages that contributed to everyone alive today as ancient DNA, simple origin, begins to dissolve. In its place emerges a quieter, more intricate history, one that begins not with one ancestral group, but with many, connected across time in ways we are only now beginning to understand. Before ancient DNA entered the picture, our understanding of early human origins depended almost entirely on what could be seen and touched. Stone tools hinted at behavior and skill. Archaeological layers offered relative times. From these fragments, researchers built a model that seemed both reasonable and stable. According to this traditional view, modern humans emerged in Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago. Fossils from sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, and Haitu in the Horn of Africa were used to trace the gradual appearance of modern features. Rounded skulls, retooth spread across the continent, suggesting a slow transition from earlier African populations into Homo sapiens as we recognize ourselves today. In this framework, Africa was seen as the starting point, but also as a relatively unified stage. While researchers acknowledge regional variation, the prevailing assumption was that these early Africans belonged to a broadly connected, moved freely enough across the continent to prevent deep, long-lasting divisions. By the time humans began leaving Africa, around 60 to 70,000 years ago, they were thought to represent a single ancestral source for all non-African populations. Outside Africa, the picture appeared more complicated, but also more dramatic. Neanderthals, in Europe and Western Asia, these groups were viewed as long-separated cousins, shaped by isolation in different environments. When modern humans arrived, they largely replaced these populations, with only minimal interbreeding. This contrast reinforced the idea that Africa was different, simpler, more continuous, and less fragmented. Even when African fossils showed unexpected diversity, it was often explained as variation within one evolving species rather than evidence of deeply separated groups. The lack of ancient DNA from Africa reinforced this assumption. DNA preservation is poor in warm, humid regions, and for many years, no genetic material could be recovered from African fossils older than a few thousand years. Without genetic data, there was little way to test whether ancient African populations were truly as connected as the model suggested. As a result, textbooks presented human origins as a branching tree that quickly narrowed into a single trunk within Africa. Before expanding outward again, Africa produced modern, humans followed. The deeper internal structure of African populations, if it existed at all, remained largely invisible. It reflected the best available evidence at the time, but it was built on absence, as much as presence. Absence of DNA, absence of well-preserved fossils from vast regions of the continent, absence of tools to detect ancient pagature. By the early 21st century, cracks were beginning to show. Some archaeological sites suggested long-term regional continuity rather than constant mixing. Certain traits appeared and disappeared in ways that did not fit a single linear progression. Still, without direct genetic evidence, these hints remained speculative. The stage was set for a shift. A new kind of data was about to enter the conversation, one capable of revealing population history even when bones and tools fell silent. And when that data finally arrived, it would show that the African roots of humanity were not only ancient, but far more complex than anyone had imagined. The turning point came not from a single discovery, but from a gradual refinement of methods that made the nearly impossible routine. Ancient DNA is fragile. After death, genetic material begins to break down almost immediately. Heat, moisture, and time fragment DNA into tiny pieces, often shorter than a sentence on a page. For decades, Africa's climate made the recovery of ancient human DNA seem unrealistic, if not impossible. Early successes came from colder regions. In Europe and Siberia, DNA extracted from Neanderthal and Denisovan bones demonstrated that genetic material could survive for tens of thousands of years. Under the right conditions, for the first time, researchers could compare ancient UN directly to those of living people. Tracing relationships with a precision fossils could never offer. The techniques improved rapidly. Clean room laboratories redeveloped to isolate damaged ancient fragments, modern intrusion. Even when only a small fraction of a genome survived, it became possible to reconstruct population history. Africa remained the greatest challenge. Most early African samples yielded nothing. Strabbling strategies and targeting skeletal elements known to preserve DNA slightly better, such as the dense bone of the inner ear. At the same time, another approach emerged that would prove just as powerful: studying the DNA of living Africans. Modern genomes carry echoes of the past. Patterns of shared mutations, deep divergences, and unexpected genetic segments can reveal ancient populations are long extinct. By comparing genomes across diverse African groups, scientists began to notice signals that did not fit the traditional model. Some lineages appear to have diverged from one another far earlier than expected. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, these divergences were not shallow branches within a single population. In some cases, the genetic distances rivaled those seen between modern humans and Neanderthals. Then came the first ancient African genomes that could be confidently analyzed. Individuals from eastern and southern Africa, dating to several thousand tree patterns. They carried genetic components linked to deeply separated African lineages, some of which no longer exist as distinct populations. As data expanded, a new picture emerged. Africa was not a single ancestral source feeding the rest of the world. It was a mosaic of populations that had been dividing. Some groups remained isolated for long stretches of time. Others acted as bridges, facilitating gene flow across regions. Approximate dates began to take shape. Certain population splits appeared to reach back 500,000 years or more, long before the emergence of anatomically modern humans. Later, between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago, multiple waves of interaction reshaped these lineages, blending ancient roots into new combinations. This genetic complexity also helped explain puzzling features in the fossil recta ruptures and position stitching statures. The patchwork appearance of early African fossils was no longer a problem to be explained away. It was a clue. Perhaps most striking was the realization that all modern humans, regardless of where they live today, carry ancestry from these ancient African populations. Some lineages contributed more to certain regions than others, but none were entirely isolated from the broader story. Even populations outside Africa inherited this deep diversity, indirectly through the African groups that ultimately left the continent. Ancient DNA had not merely added detail to an existing narrative. The human past within Africa was revealed as older, more structured, and more interconnected than the fossil record alone had suggested. And with that realization, the question was no longer whether Africa held forgotten roots of humanity, but how many of those roots had shaped who we are today. As genetic evidence accumulated, a new understanding of Africa's deep past began to take shape, one that differed sharply from earlier assumptions. The most important revelation was not a single migration or a single population, but structure. Ancient DNA showed that African populations were deeply divided for long periods of time, sometimes separated for hundreds of thousands of years, yet never entirely cut off from one another. Instead of a single ancestral population, slowly evolving into modern humans. The genetic data pointed to a network of ancient groups. These populations occupied different regions, adapted to different environments, and followed partially independent evolutionary paths. Over time, climate shifts altered landscapes, opening and closing corridors between regions. When conditions allowed, these populations met again. Some modern African populations carry lineages that split from others far earlier than previously believed. These divergences are not minor variations. They reflect separations comparable in age to those between modern humans and archaic groups outside Africa. Yet unlike Neanderthals or Denisovans, these African populations were not replaced. They persisted, interacted, and contributed to later populations. The DNA also revealed evidence of what researchers describe as ghost populations. These are ancient human groups that left no clear fossil record, but whose genetic signatures survive within living people. Their existence is inferred from unusual patterns in gene. In Africa, several such ghost lineages appear to have mixed with ancestors of modern humans, adding to the continent's genetic complexity. These findings challenge the long-held idea of a clean linear progression toward Homo sapiens. Instead, modern humans emerge from repeated episodes of mixture among diverse African populations. Anatomical modernity did not arise in isolation within one group, but through the blending of traits and genes across regions. Features associated with modern humans may have appeared in different places at different times, later coming together through migration and interbreeding. Genetic bottlenecks, once thought to define early human history primarily outside Africa, were also reinterpreted. Within Africa, population sizes fluctuated dramatically in response to environmental change. Periods of aridity fragmented populations into refuges. Wetter phases allowed expansion and contact. These cycles humans left the continent, meaning that the ancestors of all non-Africans already carried a complex genetic legacy when they began their migrations. Crucially, the DNA evidence showed that the group or groups that eventually left Africa did not represent the full diversity of the continent. They carried only a subset of African genetic variation. This explained why non-African populations appear less diverse today, not because they originated. Yet even this subset retained traces of deeply ancient African lineages embedded within their genomes. Perhaps the most humbling realization was how interconnected the story truly is. No modern population, African or non-African, descends from a single ancient group. Every genome examined reflects layers of ancestry, built from populations that once lived, moved, and met across Africa over immense spans of time. Some of these populations vanished as distinct groups. Others survive only as faint genetic echoes. What ancient DNA ultimately revealed was not a replacement of one narrative with another, but a reframing of human origins altogether. Africa was not merely the birthplace of our species. It was a long-lived engine of diversity, where humanity was a sembrinin. This process did not end when humans left the continent. It simply entered a new phase, carrying Africa's deep and forgotten roots into the wider world. These discoveries did more than rewrite a technical history of populations and genes. They changed how humanity understands itself. The recognition that all modern humans share ancestry drawn from multiple ancient African populations. What defines our species is not a single point of emergence, but a long process of connection. Ancient DNA showed that diversity is not a recent feature layered onto an otherwise uniform past. It is fundamental. The genetic differences seen among people today reflect ancient patterns that began deep in Africa. Skin color, facial features, and other visible traits are the surface expressions of histories shaped by environment and chance, not markers of separate origins. This deeper view also reshaped how extinction is understood. Many ancient African populations did not vanish in the way Neanderthals are often described. They were absorbed, their identities faded as distinct groups, but their genes endured. In that sense, the human past is not a series of clean replacements, but of continuities carried forward in new forms. The findings also brought a new appreciation for Africa itself. Rather than a single cradle, the continent appears as a vast landscape of human experimentation. Different population, each contributed solutions to survival, some of which became universal only after populations met and mixed. Modern humanity is the outcome of this long internal dialogue. There were practical consequences for science as well. Models of human evolution had to account for population structure, long-term separation, and recurrent gene flow. Telomeres became less linear, more layered. The concept of a single ancestral population gave way to a recognition that species can emerge through interaction rather than isolation. Perhaps most importantly, these discoveries refer differences among us represent different paths through the same deep history. The boundaries that once seemed sharp blur when viewed at this timescale. Ancient DNA did not offer a moral lesson or a philosophical message. It provided evidence, but the implications of that evidence are clear. We are united by a complex past, shaped by movement, mixture, and survival, across a single continent before spreading outward together. The story that ancient DNA has revealed is quieter than many older narratives, but it is also more enduring. It shows that the roots of humanity do not lie in a single moment or a single population, but in a long history of relationships unfolding across Africa. Over hundreds of thousands of years, human groups separated, adapted, and came together again, leaving traces of themselves in the germs of those who followed. Ancient DNA matters because it allows these lost connections to be seen without speculation. Where bones are fragmented and tools are silent, genetic evidence preserves memory. It records not just survival, but interaction. It shows how diversity was created, reduced, and reshaped long before humans spread across the world. And it demonstrates that the African past of our species was not simple or uniform, but fountainal. As methods continue to improve, this picture will become clearer, not more dramatic. New data may refine dates, identify additional ancient populations, but the central insight is unlikely to change. All humanity descends from a deep shared African history marked by complexity rather than isolation. Ancient DNA does not replace archaeology or fossils. It complements them, grounding interpretation in measurable inheritance. Together, these lines of evidence reveal a human story, defined by continuity across time. In that sense, the forgotten African roots uncovered by DNA are not distant or abstract. They are present in every living person, carried forward quietly generation after generation.